installment of our 2018-2019 Misinformation Speaker Series. Before I introduce Josh Tucker, I just want to remind everybody that on the 7th of November, we have Kathleen Hall-Jamieson coming, and she's going to be talking on how Russian hackers and trolls helped elect a president. That talk is actually in Rubenstein 414 AB, so not the same room as we're in today. Okay, so with business out of the way, I would like to briefly introduce our guest today, Professor Josh Tucker, who is a professor of politics at New York University. He's director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and co-director of the NYU Social Media and Political Participation Lab. He's an affiliated professor with Russian and Slavic Studies and also in data science. He's also, interestingly, co-author of The Monkey Cage, which is a politics and policy blog hosted by the Washington Post. He's won many cool awards. One that I wrote down was the American Political Science Association Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior. I've never been able to actually say that in one sentence without tripping over my tongue. Section of the APSA of the association, their Emerging Scholar Award for the top scholar in the field within 10 years of their doctorate. He's written 2 books. One, Communism's Shadow, Historical Legacies and Contemporary Political Attitudes, and the second, Regional Economic Voting, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, 1990 to 1999. His CV lists something over 4 dozen articles. I stopped counting after a certain point. I did notice that he has 7 forthcoming articles listed on his CV. I wish my CV had 7 forthcoming articles. Anyway, today's talk is going to draw from 2 projects. The first is called Trumping Hate on Twitter, Measuring the Prevalence of Online Hate Speech with an Application to the 2016 US election. And the second is called Less Than You Think, Prevalence and Predictors of Fake News Dissemination on Facebook. So Josh is going to weave these together into a perfectly coherent whole for us. So join me in welcoming Josh Tucker.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you so much for the very, very kind introduction. All right. Okay, thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'm actually going to start with the second of those. I'm going to begin with talking about fake news dissemination on Facebook. So in the aftermath of the 2016 elections, this has become a huge topic that people were interested in, trying to know what's going on with fake news on Facebook. Everybody's talking about it. But as we said, most of you in this room, this is a fake news seminar. I don't have to tell you that this is this phenomenon. But for example, you may not have known one of the stories that came out of the election that Hillary Clinton sold weapons to ISIS in the middle of the election. You might not have known that the Pope shocked the world by endorsing Donald Trump for president of the United States, and on and on and on. What we set out to do in our lab was start at almost the sort of very basic level of analysis of what's going on with fake news. There's been a lot of assessment of what's in fake news, what were people sharing. But we wanted to ask the question of who was sharing this fake news, right? Because if you're being in a policy school appropriately enough, if you're going to design interventions to try to slow the spread of fake news, you have to understand, you have to know these kind of basic facts about what's actually happening. So we wanted to ask who's actually sharing fake news. And to be able to do this, we actually had at our disposal a very unique data set that we had set up before the election for a host of other projects. But in the aftermath of the election, with the rise of fake news, we were in this perfect situation where we were like, we can actually go and answer this question. So what was this data? We had a survey in the field over the course of the 2016 elections called the 2016 SMAP election survey, which was a panel survey that we spoke to people 3 times over the course of the election. Now, what made this survey unique, and I'm not going to talk about this, was 2 things. One, for a large sample of these people, we were sampling from people who had given their Twitter handles to the pollsters. So we have all sorts of other papers where we're relying on the Twitter data. But we also did something for the first time with this survey, where we asked people if they would be willing to share their Facebook data with us for the purpose of analysis. Now, Facebook data is private, so they have to willingly give us their Facebook data. Now, We asked them twice, we gave them a chance to opt out. We asked them the first time before we did it. They could check buttons to make sure they knew what they were doing. They did willingly give us the Facebook data. I can categorically state here, for the record, we have not sold that Facebook data to Cambridge Analytica or anyone else along the way at all, and it's kept in a very, very secure sort of lockbox type setup. But we didn't know how many people were going to be willing to do this. So we actually built an app as part of our survey, and at the end of the survey, people who were willing to do this, we asked them if they would be willing to share their data with us, and they could fill out an app that then allowed us to collect a limited amount of their Facebook data from over the course of the election. We then were able to, as it turned out, collect data from almost 40% of our entire sample, which turned out to be 50% of the respondents with Facebook accounts in our sample. So we had over half of our sample was willingly shared their Facebook data with us. Now, as an aside, what was super interesting about this, when we started this, I thought maybe we'll get 5%, 6%. We actually talked to people at Facebook. We talked to a couple other surveys that done there. We just had no idea how much it was. We did give people a monetary incentive to do this, but the monetary incentive, which was in the system that the pollster uses to reward people for participating in polls in the first place, was $5. Right? So for $5, half of the sample shared their Facebook data with us. I think this is sort of tangential to what I'm talking about here, but there's actually a very interesting area of research that we need to start looking into, which is the discontinuity between how much bureaucrats and policymakers think people value data privacy, how much people say when you ask them in surveys how they value data privacy, and then how much when you actually offer them money to share you their data, they do value the data privacy when you put things. Now, look, they were sharing it with academics, people are often willing to share data with academics for research for free, but this was super interesting to us. In the climate that we were in of GDPR, it just seemed to me, I didn't think we were gonna get nearly this high an outcome, but we did. So we have this data for over 1,300 people and one of the things we got from them was what they posted on Facebook, which meant that after the election, we could go and look who had shared fake news. So that's exactly what we went and did. We started with the most conservative sort of list we could imagine of the hardcore fakest of fake news, right? Like, these are websites that purported to be news organizations that did not exist. And we drew on Craig Silverman's excellent reporting in BuzzFeed. This is the Craig Silverman BuzzFeed list. For the paper, which I'm very pleased, first, I've neglected to mention at the beginning, this is co-authored work with Jonathan Nagler and Andy Guess. Andy's at Princeton, Jonathan is one of the co-directors of the NYU SMAP Lab with me as well. And the paper is now forthcoming in Science Advances, actually. And so there's lots of robustness tests in the paper using a bunch of different lists of fake news, but this is the one we started with. This is what I'm going to show you. This was your sort of hardcore fake news. So your Denver Guardian, which does not exist. There is no newspaper called the Denver Guardian, right? And so we took this list and we start off with all the work we're doing here is at the domain level. So we took these domains, these identified fake news lists, and we went into our Facebook data and we looked to see who was sharing them. So the first major takeaway from the study that we've done so far is that when we look at who shares fake news, this is what you call a power law, right? Most people shared nothing. Some people, as you can see all the way out, there's someone out here at 25, having shared 25 different articles from these domains. Some people shared quite a bit. So the first takeaway from this is, and again, this is the importance of digging into the data, doing basic research. Most people were not sharing fake news, in our sample anyway. So we have small numbers of people, and there's really interesting research, whereas Brianna is here right now, who's part of this team at the Lazar Lab in Northeastern, and this is Brianna and I presented at the same conference before, and David and I presented at the same conference. The first time David and I did this, they find in their paper very similar findings from Twitter, right? These were two studies by two labs going on completely separate. We only realized that they were both happening when we started being at conferences talking about this together. Finds exactly the same thing. And there are some other studies by like Matt Genskow from Stanford and Hunt Alcott at NYU looking at some other types of data that are also finding this sort of power law development. So this is not, I think, the impression you get about fake news when you listen to it on the news media, when you listen to pundits talk about it. But as a number of studies have developed that have done deep dives into this, we're finding this power law relationship. Which is not to say it's not a problem and then it's can't be influential if it's a power law relationship. If the people who are doing this are in particularly consequential locations in the country, it could be. But I think this is a change in the narrative from what we've thought about the prevalence of fake news. All right, now, but the really cool thing we can do with our data is because we have a survey, we don't have to deal with trying to infer characteristics of people who are doing this from social media profiles. And there's a whole sort of art to doing that. But we actually know a lot about these people. So we were able to look at socio-demographic characteristics to see who shared fake news. So who shared fake news during the 2016 elections? First off, it's not Democrats, nor is it liberals or moderates. So the people who are sharing fake news are overwhelmingly conservative in our sample. Now, there is a sort of school of thought in social psychology. There are sets of arguments that people make about social psychological arguments relating personality to partisanship, relating traits to why you might think conservatives might be more likely to share fake news than liberals. I am going to bracket that for the moment. Maybe that is what's driving this, but there's an alternative story that could be driving this, which is a supply side story, right? We know that from people who've done analysis of the content of the fake news, those sites that I showed you before, the fake news in the 2016 election campaign was overwhelmingly pro-Trump, all right? So it's possible that the reason that conservatives and very conservatives are sharing much more fake news than moderates or liberals is nothing inherent about being conservative or liberal. It's just about there was much more fake news out there that would be pleasing to conservatives, right? And so this bears watching as we go into the 2018 election cycle, with Democrats all being in the opposition and the left being in the opposition. We will see now whether and Trump's popularity ratings being kind of low, we will see whether it will be very interesting to see if this persists. If it persists through several cycles with different sort of political situations, then we might think there's something more inherent going on here. But it is a fact in the data that we have that this fake news in 2016 from our sample was much more likely to be shared by conservatives. All right, so we put that aside, that could be a supply side. We looked at a number of other socio-demographic characteristics to see what was determinant of what correlated with who shared fake news. Some of the ones that you would think would be the sort of jump to the top of your head, education, income, have no relationship to who shared fake news. What it was, the one variable that completely jumps out though, when you look at this, is age. So what it turns out to be the case is that, and this is what we call a monotonically increasing relationship, the older you get, the more likely you are to share fake news. But it really picks up dramatically with the over 65 age group, right? So in our sample, the over 65s were sharing a higher proportion of fake news than everybody beneath them combined. This result, which we have pushed on, turns out to be quite robust. So what this is a model that comes from a multivariate regression model where we can control for all these different characteristics simultaneously and still estimate the effects of sharing fake news. And what this shows you is the likelihood of sharing fake news is on the right side. These little point estimates are our best estimate of how much more fake news you share from each of these categories. The lines here are error, how much noise there is in the data. So if you see the lines all the way away from the 0 line, that gives us great confidence there is a positive effect. What's different from the histograms I just showed you, which was just looking at the raw counts of the data, was that this is now controlling for all these other factors. And the primary takeaway from this, other than to see, by the way, that education, income have absolutely no relationship to this, it's also not the number of Facebook posts, because it's possible that people are just sharing more stuff, and if you just share stuff randomly, you share more fake news. So that's the first thing we sort of had to rule out. It wasn't just people who were sharing a lot. So it's not just people who are older, have more time on their hands, and spend more time sharing links on Facebook. And the key thing for this is that when we control for all of these factors, age still remains very robust and very significant. So then we sort of pushed on this to say, okay, well, how confident can we be in this finding? I've showed you one set of data. So we ran a whole set of different robustness tests on this. Just because Matt asked me to do a second paper too, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But just to give you a sense, we used 5 different data sets that were out there with all sorts of different people who had coded fake news, relying on different classifications to make sure there wasn't something about the Silverman list. They all show the same results. It's completely robust to using different data sets. Now, of course, they're all kind of correlated with each other because people are going to come up with similar classifications. The biggest thing we did, the most recent thing we did, is that we actually went, one of the criticisms that we got around the original version of the paper from the reviewers was that everything was going on at domain level. So not everything at these sites might have been fake news. They might have been running some Reuters articles and things through them and things like that. So we actually did use a data set coding at the article level. And I'll show you a result in one second where we looked at actually people's propensity to share fake news versus hard news to make sure this wasn't just a sharing news phenomenon. And finally, we're at this point, we're trying to work with the new Social Science One Research Institute research initiative to be able to replicate these analyses on the entire population of Facebook users. So there's a concern, potential concern with our data could be that there's something special about the people who chose to share the data with us. So in the future, we're trying to go replicate this. Yeah, I'll show you. I have a couple things to show from this.
Did you guys have access to information about internet sophistication? Because one might think that it correlates with age in a negative.
So I will get to that in one second. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. So the simple answer is no, we don't control for this, but that's that's like the next slide once I show you the robustness test. So just very quickly, this is the result when we did this at the article level. We were able to get a list that Matt Genskow and Hunt Alcott had coded as part of their work where they were doing from browsing data. So we had a list of, I think it's like 900 different articles. Obviously the numbers go down, but the pattern remains very strong. This actually was the newest thing we did, and it was super interesting because what we did was we redid the analysis using coding by Solomon Messing and Eitan Bakshi at Facebook, where they had coded hard news versus fake news domains. So we just looked at news sharing, right? I showed you a minute ago that the number of links you shared was not, this was all robust to it. But what this did was we ran through all the sort of hard news domains, and what we find is that the effect for age, the gray dots here are hard news and the black is fake news. The gray dots for age go completely away. There's no effect on being older on sharing news generally. So we control for how many links you share, but when we run the analysis on hard news, so this really is a kind of fake news story. All right, so that leads to the question, which is right where we're going with the question, is like, so if this is a real thing, and I have additional reasons to really that I can't talk about right now to really suspect this is a real thing, right? Like that we feel very confident in our finding here. So if this is a real thing, what is it about this that explains why older people are more likely to share fake news on Facebook than younger people? And so Occam's razor, the simplest explanation that jumps immediately to mind is exactly your question that you just asked, which is the digital literacy question, right? And so the story you hear, over and over, essentially the story you hear about this is you have people my age telling their parents to go on Facebook so they can see pictures of their grandchildren. So people who wouldn't have gotten on Facebook get on Facebook, they go on Facebook to see pictures of their grandchildren. We know that during the course of the 2016 election, and Facebook has taken, Matt and I have been involved in talking with, Facebook is doing a lot to try to change this now, but in the 2016 election, like if you looked at a Monkey Cage blog post on the Washington Post, it was a headline, it was a picture, and it was a blurb. And if you looked at an article from the Denver Guardian on Facebook, it was a headline, a picture, and a blurb. They looked exactly the same, right? So you get people who are not familiar with this technology going onto Facebook to see pictures of their grandchildren. They then, while they're there, they happen to see that it turns out that the FBI agent who caught Hillary Clinton and Huma Abedin having sex with each other has killed themselves. And that seems terrible. And their friends should know this, because this is a really bad thing, right? And it looks just like the New York Times article that they saw in their news feed as well, right? So that's the simplest explanation, right? That it's an Occam's razor thing. In a sense, right, that is an encouraging explanation because digital literacy is potentially something that could be addressed. However, these results also suggest that one of the things we've heard in the aftermath of the 2016 election and all the explosion of fake news is the way to address this is we got to go into the schools and teach kids about digital literacy, right? Like, according to these findings, the kids are all right? That's not the problem, right? So teaching digital literacy in the schools, which is a great thing, and I've seen some awesome stuff in my kids' curriculum that they're doing, but if we're right, and this is about digital literacy among people over age 65, that's not going to solve the problem teaching it to high school students. So then that pushes us as good social scientists to try to consider what I am trying to euphemistically calling non-literacy age-related factors. So there could be biological explanations for the way that our brain processes information at different stages of development. And we know that the way information is being delivered through these digital media, streaming fast, lots of things that you're seeing at the same time, that this is a new way that people are consuming information. So we can't rule out the fact that there might be something about this new way of information consumption that interacts with different stages of development, and that maybe this is something about the processing that's going on at this point. There's another interesting question, I think, that about non-literacy age-related factors, which is that It's possible, and I think this really gets to the crux of the matter here about understanding the mechanisms by which this is happening. It's possible that people don't share fake news because they think it's true. It's possible people share fake news because it reaffirms their identity. It's another way of showing their partisanship online, who they vote for. And as I've given these talks earlier, I remember one person standing up and relating a story of my mother-in-law keeps posting this stuff. I keep telling her it's not true. I show her on the link to the websites where it's not true. And finally, she turned to me and said, you know what? I don't care if it's true. I just want everyone to know I hate Hillary Clinton, right? So if that's what's going on, and it turns out that concurrently, people who are older prefer this kind of identity politics and for whatever reason are attracted to this sort of expressive behavior in the current climate, that could be explaining it as well. That would be a very, very different explanation from digital literacy. It's less, it's not Occam's razor because it's a multi-step explanation, right? People aren't doing this because they think it's true, and simultaneously there's something about this kind of identity expression that appeals more to older people. And that would fly in the face of certain theory about younger people as well, but I think that's one thing we have to think about here. There's a third potential explanation, which I think is interesting, which is that this could be a technical explanation, which goes something like this. That the way that platforms are trying to deal with low quality news information right now and trying to sort of react to what's going on, and whether they were doing this as much in 2016 is another question, is by downgrading the likelihood that you're going to see that information when it shows up in your news feed. And so when you log on to Facebook or any social media platform and you see posts by other people, there is a feeling that you're just seeing chronologically the most recent posts that have showed up. But that's not actually what's happening. There are huge algorithms at work within all of these platforms that are determining exactly what you're going to see. And one way you can deal with the problem of fake news without getting into the business of censorship is to just downweight by quality, right? The quality of the source. Make that a feature in the newsfeed determination. Newsfeed ranking, right, works to make it less likely that you're going to see something if you have a lot of content. If you're on Facebook and you have 5,000 friends on Facebook, right, and Tim and I are friends on Facebook, and then Facebook downweights something I'm going to see, I've posted, Tim's probably not going to see it because he's going to log on and Facebook's going to have hundreds and thousands of things they can serve up to Tim. If you're on Facebook and you have a dozen friends that post once a week, you're going to see what they post if you come on there because downweighting is not going to solve the problem. So it's possible there's a mechanical thing at work here, which in that case it would be maybe that we're picking up this over 65 effect because people over age 65 have fewer friends on average than younger people. I don't have data on that, I'm just speculating, but I think it's a reasonable speculation. That would then imply that this is not something that has to do with being over age 65, it's something that has to do with not having a lot of friends on Facebook, and I'm not making the correlation that having a lot of friends on Facebook means you have a lot of friends in real life. But there are people who make more effort in having friends on Facebook and people who don't. The key takeaway from this is that even though we found this one finding, the next step of determining what these mechanisms are is super important because the different mechanisms have different implications for how you might do interventions on policy, right? If it is about digital literacy, that suggests one set of interventions. If it's about having fewer numbers of friends, then digital literacy isn't going to solve the problem at all, right? And it's not going to affect these things. So that's our that's our contribution right now, and where we are with this. So I could quickly for a couple of minutes, if there are any questions on this, or I can jump into the next presentation, and then we can just do questions at the end. Do you have a preference?
Maybe just go through your talk. And then
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna now. So that's the first paper that Matt wanted me to present here. So we're now going to go from fake news on Facebook to something even more depressing, which is hate speech on Twitter. And so what are we going to talk about? So what I'm going to talk to you about now. The first thing I want to note: this is a project, different project we're doing in the SMAP lab. This was a large effort from a lot of people getting involved. Alex Siegel, who will be on the job market next year, currently a postdoc at the Immigration Policy Lab out at Stanford, is the lead author on this. She's fantastic. But we have a whole host of people. You have Yanni Nikitin, who's a PhD student at NYU. Joanna Sterling, who was a PhD student at NYU, is now working for Facebook. That's starting to happen increasingly commonly with students coming out of my lab. And then Bethany, who is a student at NYU, and then Rich Bonneau and John Nagler, who are both co-directors of the SMAP lab with me. So this is a real collaborative effort. All right, so we just said you followed 2016, you would have heard about fake news online. You followed the election in 2016, you also probably saw headlines like this. Hate seeping into the US mainstream, Donald Trump and the escalation of hate, and then what we're working off of here is this final thing, that there's been a massive rise in hate speech on Twitter during the presidential election. This is what we're going to call the received wisdom, right? This is what people think has happened on Twitter over the course of the election. And particularly what people are interested in, what we're interested in this paper is not whether there was hate speech in general on the internet over 2016, but what we're interested in here is whether there was this mainstreaming of online hate. And so we're going to look at essentially to what extent did online hate speech and white nationalist rhetoric on Twitter, so all we're looking at is Twitter here, increase over the course of the 2016 and in the aftermath of the election. We're going to define hate speech and white nationalist language and using these kind of definitions. So hate speech is sort of bias-motivated, hostile, malicious language targeted at a person or group because of their group membership, because of those innate characteristics. That's the definition of hate speech that we're working from. We take this from other people. We are not a sort of speech-oriented lab, even a communications lab, so we try, much the same way we outsourced coding the fake news to other people so that we can't be accused of cherry picking, we're going to try and do as much of that as we can here, outsourcing all our kind of dictionaries to other folks here. So white nationalist language is going to be rhetoric or content that praises known white nationalist groups, shows excessive pride in the white race, espouses white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, or focuses on the inferiority of non-whites. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. Did this language go up over Twitter? So over the course of the election on Twitter. So essentially, this mainstreaming of online hate, all those headlines I put there, what the sort of, the colloquial way we can talk about I think the theory is underlying all of this, is that the success of Donald Trump over the course of the 2016 election campaign either did one of two things. The first, which I think is the thing most people are talking about, is that this gives people permission to sort of, release their inner racist, right? That lots of people have harbored potentially these racist sentiments or these hateful sentiments against different groups. They don't think that we live in an era where this is not an acceptable thing that you say in public. All of a sudden, here comes along a guy who runs for president. He makes his presidential announcement that he's getting into campaign by calling Mexicans rapists and goes from there. And people are watching this. And as the campaign goes on, they say, this guy who should have been, this seemed like this was completely out of the bounds of what we talked about in politics, is talking about this stuff. So maybe now it's okay, I can say these things in public too. There's a second potential explanation, which could be that Trump is actually convincing people. He's taking a lot of people who aren't racist and he's making really convincing arguments to them. And they're saying, oh yeah, I'm picking up on this. Right, that's a great idea. Let me change my opinions and now I'll start expressing these kinds of things. It could be pieces of the two of those things. I think it's the former is what people are talking about. But actually, from the point of view of our empirical analysis, it doesn't really matter. So the argument here is that Trump's success leads to this increase of hate speech usage online over the course of the election, this massive rise of hate speech, the mainstreaming of hate. All right, so we thought as empiricists, how would we actually know whether or not that was happening? And what we thought, and the genesis behind this is that I get a call after the 2016 election and somebody says to me, hey, we're gonna have a conference in 6 weeks where we're going to, on digital media, and there's gonna be people from the platform there, and there's gonna be people from foundations and people working in civic tech. We'd like a few academic researchers to show us some research about what was happening in digital online over the course of the 2016 election campaign. And I said, oh great, we have this paper, we just published it, it's about echo chambers, it'll be really useful. And he said, no, we want something new. And I thought, oh, new, in 6 weeks. Okay, so what could we do? Well, we had these enormous collections of Twitter data from the 2016 election, both candidate-specific and other collections. So I thought, okay, we can find the increase in hate speech that everyone was talking about. So what would this look like? So imagine if you had time on the x-axis here, this dotted line is the campaign, and then you have a way to measure the prevalence of hate speech online, or the incidence of hate speech, whatever you want to call it. The basic story I just told you is something like this. Trump declares, it's at this lower level. The Trump effect is that more people start using this. He starts to do better than expected, so it keeps going up. He gets the nomination, it goes up even more. The presidency and continues to go up. So that could be one thing we could look for to substantiate this narrative. There's another story you could tell, which is like what really matters is the election. And for those of you, many of you in this room, I'm sure, woke up to the same thing on their Facebook feeds and the days after the election. Everyone's saying, I can't believe I live in this country. You know, I didn't know this, but now there's a swastika, you know, that's in Brooklyn somewhere, right? And it's all over my Facebook feed and that kind of stuff. So it could look something like this. It could be that actually everyone thought he was going to get clobbered. This was going to be the thing that, you know, caused the Republican Party to reinvent itself. This kind of nationalist sentiment was still going to be relegated to the fringes, but then he wins, and it all changes. That's the kind of like a post-election day story. Either of those, I think, would have been consistent with this mainstreaming of online hate and this sort of Trump effect along these lines. All right, so what do we do to try to do this? All right, so the first thing is, I'm now going to warn you in the spirit of the current era. This is a trigger warning if anyone is offended by language. The first point I want to, so this is going to be offensive in a second, lots of offensive words. So the first point I want to make is, there is plenty of hate speech on Twitter, right? So when you ask what is this that we're coding, this is the kind of stuff we're coding. There's no need for me to sort of read this out loud, but you can see these kinds of quotes. This is not really debatable whether this is hate speech. This is not a semantic thing, it's not on the edge. There is hate speech out there. There's also white nationalist language, just to give you examples of what we're talking about. So peaceful white nationalists protect beauty, family, and land. Anti-whites want to destroy these things. Donald Trump's means we don't ever have to apologize for being white again. Hillary Clinton, what is chasing down every white person, assimilating them and calling it diversity? It's white genocide. So these are what we're talking about with white nationalist language. And for those of you who've never dug into the weeds in Twitter, you'll find there's a lot of this stuff. All right, but our question is whether it went up, whether it increased. So what we set out to do was we went and looked at this, and we drew on two different sources of data. And the story of the paper is we started doing this with small amounts of data. We're surprised by what we found, and we kept pushing on it to see about the robustness of our results. But I'm not going to take you through every step. What I'm just going to show you is where we are with the sort of final version of this paper. So we built up this data set where we got 2 years worth of what we're going to call political Twitter, from basically the date that Trump declared the election until the summer of 2017. So we got 9 months after the election, about 8 months after the election, so we could see if what happens with this post-election period. One of the things with academic papers, eventually you have to stop collecting data because you have to write the paper. You can't just keep running it forever. So we have 2 years worth of data here. We got 150 million tweets from our Hillary Clinton collection and 600 million tweets from our Trump collection. So these collections were basically, they had the candidate's name and then slogans associated with the candidate. So if you had I'm with her, that ended up in our Hillary collection. If you had MAGA or Make America Great, that ended up in our Trump collection. This is a subject for another discussion. But this was an interesting finding unto itself that we got 600 million tweets in the Trump collection and 150 million in the Hillary collection. But that being said, together we have 750 million tweets in this collection. However, as we sort of pushed forward with this project, we thought, well, maybe one thing that was going on was that there was maybe this style of talking about politics on Twitter wasn't necessarily what people were talking about. What they were talking about just in general on Twitter. So we were diving around looking in politics data to see if there was more hate in the politics data. But what about general conversations? So we drew on the fact that in our lab, we've put together a random sample. And we've done this a couple different ways, but this random sample that we used here, we've been following a random sample of about 500,000 Americans, and it really is a random sample. We used a random number generator to generate Twitter IDs and then check to see if there were people with those IDs. And then we checked to try to make sure these people were in the United States. And so we have another 400 billion tweets that are not sampled on politics. So there are different ways you collect data from Twitter. This is using keyword searches. This is using ID searches. So we're watching these people IDs. We get all of the tweets on any subject. And this is just tweets about the presidential election. So combined though, everything I'm going to show you right now is based on our analysis of essentially 1.2 billion with a B, tweets, not million. So this is, while it's a piece of the internet, it's not the whole internet. There's pieces of Twitter that we're missing, and I have a big slide at the end that says caveats, which I will absolutely make sure I get to because it's really important. Nevertheless, this is over 1 billion incidences of speech that took place online over this 2-year period. Okay, so what do we find here? How do we go about doing this? So our primary form of analysis that we used was to take dictionaries that other people had developed of words that were considered hateful words, and we ran them through our collection, and we saw if there were tweets in that collection that contained those words. I'll talk about this much more in a minute, but that method generates lots of false positives. And so what we then did was we applied on top of that, after we got this whole collection that had any of these words in these dictionaries, we used machine learning to screen out the false positives. I'll tell you a little bit more about that process in a second. However, we also, again, as we kept going with this project to try to see if there were things we were missing, the problem with dictionary-based methods, and again, we didn't want our lab to be picking out the words, so we were using things other people had done. But one of the criticisms or concerns that was raised, questions that was raised originally is, well, do people, these dictionaries, these are created by psychologists, or psychologists over years, they're based on offline interactions, don't people talk differently about things on the internet? So what we ended up doing, and I'll explain this in more detail later, what we ended up doing was also using a non-dictionary based method. The intuition of which was, we went to places online where we knew that people talked about where essentially these kind of hate speech groups hung out, because they were on bulletin boards that were sort of dedicated to topics like white nationalism or all sorts of things kind of like this. We went and found places online in a different social media platform called Reddit, where we knew people talked in this particular way. And we used this to get a sense of what hate speech looks like in the wild on the internet. And then we could compare our Twitter data to that as well and see if it looked more like it as time went by. That's the intuition. I'll explain a little bit more about the methods in a moment. The key point is that both of these methods, the dictionary-based method and then screening out the false positives, as well as the semantic similarity with the Reddit data, with the alt-right Reddit data, both of these allow us to measure this, right? So we can actually, using both of these methods, we have something to put on the y-axis. And what's good about it from a robustness standpoint is we have very different things to put on the y-axis, so totally different ways of getting at this. All right, so how exactly did we use the dictionary-based methods of doing this? I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are as interested in the technical details. But basically, it was a three-step process. This was the process we used. We took dictionaries from other existing sources, so like HateBase, the Racial Slur Database, the Anti-Defamation League, and this got us actually over 4,000 terms, close to 4,500 terms. We actually had started off first time with a more restrictive version of this. We went to a larger one because again, we were concerned we might have been missing things. We then removed a whole bunch of terms that are in those databases that can be used in a derogatory way, but when they are on Twitter, they're generally not being used in the derogatory way. Words like pizza and taco are gonna generate, most people when they talk about pizza and tacos on Twitter, they're talking about what they had for lunch. They're not using this in a derogatory way. We then did some things where we looked at words that frequently co-occurred with the remaining hateful words online in both Twitter and Reddit, trying actually in the dictionary-based method to beef up the internet appropriability of it. This was the first step we were doing. That added some more terms. Problems, though, with this dictionary-based method is there are words is a bunch of different things. Why does it generate false positives? Well, first off is the homonyms problem, right? There are actually words that are in the hate speech dictionary that mean different things. So we have chink is included as an anti-Asian hate speech word in these hate speech dictionaries, but when people talked about Trump's foreign policy being a chink in his armor, that's not hate speech being directed at Donald Trump. That's a comment on his foreign policy. It can be parts of other words. It turns out the Twitter handle that people use, the word bitch actually turns out to be remarkably popular in Twitter handles, and so we don't want everyone who calls themselves, like football bitch or whatever lots of things, this was angry bitch, that's not everything they're saying is hate speech that follows that. So we have all sorts of different, and then there's also a lot of anti-hate speech claims that use hate speech words, right? So you'll see some examples here of this kind of thing. So we want those out too. So lesson number one from studying this, if you want to study hate speech online or incivility or any of these things, and all you do is use dictionary-based methods, you are going to radically overestimate the prevalence of whatever it is you're talking about. And not only that, if you're trying to do something else with the data, you're going to introduce a lot of noise into your data. Because dictionary-based methods is one of the first things we learned early on in this project. Another thing, for those of you who do this kind of big data science analysis, this is just all the more urging that even if you're using, this data set has 1 billion tweets in it, right? Like, read some of them. if you are doing big data analysis, look at your data. We learned this. The first step we did in this project was we had all these people who were involved with the project. We had lots of them read through 300 of the tweets. And so we could get, for each of these different categories, we could start seeing this. It was by sitting down and reading this stuff that we realized there was going to be this huge overestimate in the data. And it ends up being about 50%. So it's really important, even when you're doing the biggest of big data analysis, to make sure you look at your data. But so that's the first takeaway. All right, so what did we end up doing? We did this training ourselves. We ended up training undergraduates to code a whole lot of these tweets as whether they contained hate speech or not. Then we sent it out to the crowd using a platform called Crowdflower, which now has been taken over by somebody else and has a different name to it. I forget exactly what it's called now. But we sent out 25,000 of these tweets, essentially 3,000 tweets from each of the hate speech categories we had that either contained hate speech or white nationalist rhetoric. And we had those coded online so we could get these inter-coder reliability and see how much people were able to do. We asked very simple questions to our coders. For someone who's been at this for a while of trying to apply machine learning to text, another sort of takeaway from this is that the simpler the questions you can ask coders, I think the better machine learning models work. So the things, when you can dichotomize things, you're in much better shape than when you're asking your coders to put things on a 5-point scale, for example. So simply, did this tweet contain hate speech? Does this tweet contain white nationalist rhetoric? We trained them up. We use these methods, that you can do this with the crowd now because you can use what are called gold standard questions, questions you know the answers to. People who are getting sufficiently numbers of them wrong, you can kick them out. You then can use inter-coder reliability across lots of people. So we had a ton of data. And then this is the takeaway I just mentioned a second ago, that according to this coding process, fewer than half of the tweets identified by the dictionary method actually ended up having hate speech. So because of that, we trained a machine learning classifier on it to remove these tweets. Then what we're going to do is we also, as a sort of robustness test, we are going to look at both the daily proportion of tweets that contain hate speech or white nationalist rhetoric, or the daily proportion of unique users. So people have said both of these things are sort of important questions. We also replicate the entire analysis in the appendix of the papers. We do the entire analysis with counts as well. So we have this sort of a 2x2 you can think of here. Are we looking at proportion, or are we looking at counts? And are we looking at actual numbers of tweets, or are we looking at unique users who use that language? Everything I show you is completely robust to what all the conclusions hold, no matter how we actually measure these things. All right, so here's the first bit of data here. This is a chart. This actually is this is the raw number of tweets that were classified as hate speech across all of our data sets here. So the blue is the Clinton, red is Trump, and the green is the random sample. And this is, of course, over this 2-year full period. These are raw counts. These aren't counts of users. These are actually counts of tweets. These aren't proportions, actually counts. So you can add these together to get the total. So a few things come out of this to look at. First off, there's lots of hateful stuff on Twitter, right? In any given month, we've got, on average, 25, 30, 35,000 tweets that come up classified as being hate speech. So it's out there. However, and here's this same chart shown in terms of proportions, this is a data set with 1.2 billion tweets in it, right? We have on average about 50 million tweets a month. So 25,000, 50,000, that translates into 0.1%, 0.2%. This is all positive research. I'm not going to stand here and make normative statements. We might think 0.1% of tweets containing hate speech is way, way, way too high for a liberal democracy. We might think it's much, much lower than we thought it was based on reading media reports about what's going on Twitter. I leave that aside. The research question I have here today is about change over time. And when you look at these graphs, and again, these are raw counts, these are not statistical tests, and everything is sort of lumped together here, these are not the pictures I showed you at the beginning. There is no linear diagonal increase, nor is there a sharp discontinuity at the election and then a big change afterwards. When you look at here, this does sort of, right, these pointers don't work on televisions. These streaks stand out. These are misogynist, these are tweets from the Trump collection. What's going on here, and this is going to presage where we're going in a second, what's actually going on here is this is the Muslim travel ban that was announced by Trump. And if you remember, Sally Yates quits as part of this process, the Deputy Attorney General. There's a tremendous amount of misogynistic tweets at that point in time directed against Sally Yates. Hillary Clinton also tweets for the first time after the election during the Muslim travel ban. She attracts a lot of attention. That's what this spike is here. And this, actually, this spike question, this is what ends up being the bottom line story. So what this graph is, and I'm going to zoom in a second, so don't worry if you can't read it. I can barely read it, and I'm standing next to it. But you can see the pictures, right? So what this is 9 different graphs. This is our hate speech broken down into this is one of the more depressing things I've ever have to do in my life giving talks, but I mean, essentially what this is anti-Asian hate speech, anti-Black hate speech, anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, etc. The major, and again, no statistics here, just raw data, raw counts. The major takeaway from this graph, though, is that none of these pictures look like the pictures I showed you at the beginning. It's not that hate speech increased over the course of the 2016 election campaign, at least in what we looked at. And we have pushed on these data for a year and a half, developed whole new methods to come to these conclusions. Hate speech is bursty. That's what we see. So for example, this is anti-Muslim hate speech. This is the Bataclan nightclub shooting in Paris. And so when you get the Bataclan nightclub shooting, which is attributed to ISIS, there's an upsurge in anti-Muslim hate speech. However, within not too long a period of time, it goes down in terms of the trend. And this is the point I'm going to make at the very end of the talk, which I'm going to come back to at the end of the talk, which is we have a real issue with how people think about what they know about what's going on social media. And the basic problem with social media for understanding what's happening is that it's really easy to find evidence of anything on social media because there's so much of it and it's optimized for search. But there's another problem on top of this. Imagine you are writing a newspaper story about hate speech on Twitter right after the Bataclan nightclub shooting, and you measure right there. And you're going to be more sophisticated than previously. You're going to go to Twitter and you're actually going to do some analysis and you're going to grab tweets from the last 2 weeks, right? If you measure right now at a 2-week period, it's not just that there's a lot of hate speech going on right then, it's that it actually, that's the correct story. It has been increasing over the last week and a half. But when you zoom out over 2 years, you get a very different picture. There's another kind of very interesting takeaway, or depressing takeaway, whatever you want to call it, from this chart, which I'll just mention, especially in light of events that have happened recently. All of these things, I mean, here we're down to 0.0002, right? This is 0.02% of tweets contain anti-Muslim hate speech at some of the high water marks. Most of the time, it's much even lower than this. If you go look at the paper and you zoom in on here, what's different about these y-axes are not the same. The vast majority of the hate speech that we find is either misogynistic or anti-Black. It is not these other categories. And actually, given this is white nationalist language, again, bursty, drops off dramatically in our data set after the election, actually. Just given the events that have happened in the last few days, I just want to point out at this, and I'll come back to this at the end of the conclusion. This is anti-Semitic hate speech, right? This goes out to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. There were days that we found 4 anti-Semitic tweets in the that we found 4 anti-Semitic tweets in the collection. Given what happened to prominent journalists, in particular prominent Jewish journalists, and Julia Yaffe is someone who I know, I sort of watched that all unfold in real time, this was a surprise to us, right? We thought we were going to certainly find an increase in anti-Semitic hate speech. And in part, this is a function of our research design. Had we tracked journalists, which is something we're thinking of starting doing, and tracking tweets mentioning journalists instead of politicians, you would have seen a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic hate speech at points in these patterns. Whether it would have come back down to the trend line, I don't know, right? But I just thought I'd mention this because we've seen a ton in the last few days about how much the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And sort of to presage where I'm going with all of this, one of the things, just to step out for a second, out of the scholarly role into the normative role for a second here, that concerns me, and why I think this kind of research is so incredibly important, is that there is a possibility, from having done this, that we're living in an environment where we actually have very, very few people in the country who espouse these kinds of views. But we live in a media environment where, and we do all sorts of other research in my lab on bots and trolls, which I'm not going to present more than 2 papers today on one thing, but like we live in a media environment where it's possible for small numbers of people to be really amplified. And part of it is through journalists writing stories about phenomenon, part of it is through things like bots and trolls, but it worries me, and I was so surprised to find this, and I see it again in the aftermath of the Pittsburgh shooting, that there might be some self-reinforcing going on, where if we keep saying there are lots of people who are anti-Semitic, even though there aren't that many people who are anti-Semitic, it may make, for a new generation of people, anti-Semitism seem more acceptable, because they grow up in a line where they think there are lots of anti-Semitic people out there. So that's sort of just because we happen to talk about this because of the date that I'm giving this talk right now, in the aftermath of what happened in Pittsburgh. I'll get back to that sort of more conclusion stuff. But I think this is part of what I'm thinking about and what sort of worries me about these findings. White nationalist language. Okay, then for the social scientists here in the room, of course, everything I've shown you so far is just data, is raw data. So we do all sorts of different statistical tests on this. We use something called interrupted time series analysis, which allows us to measure trend lines and also to measure that regression discontinuity, whether that discontinuity happens at the time of the election. And we can measure the trend line before and after the election. And whatever we do, these are almost all negative. We ran a lot of tests at one particular point in time in the Hillary Clinton, I think this is the one in the Hillary Clinton data set. There is a tiny statistically significant effect on one of the trend lines. But for those of you who do statistics, know that if you run 20 tests, one of them will come up with a 5% significance level, and just because of random chance alone. And that's basically what all these results look like. So we've got lots of different things. This goes across the Clinton data. So this is the Trump data set. This is the Clinton data set. This is the random sample data set. Same thing. We don't find this increase in the random sample data set either. This is white nationalist tweets in the random sample. So contrary to received wisdom, what our analysis shows so far, is that it does not show a systematic increase in hate speech over the course of the campaign or after the election on Twitter in the populations we examined. Similarly, we don't see any significant increases in white nationalist rhetoric over the course of the campaign in any of our 3 data sets. There is, in one of the data sets, as I said, there is this one statistically significant effect, but it's substantively very small, and as I said, we ran a whole lot of tests, and this, you might expect one to pop up just by chance anyway. But it's substantively very small anyway. All right, so now we come back to the concern we had before. What if, so we've looked in a lot of places. We've looked now over 2 years worth of data. We've looked at the data about the elections, which would be, again, from an Occam's razor perspective, where we most likely expect to find a Trump effect in the election. We've looked at data from having nothing to do with politics as well. We've looked across all these different types, we've disaggregated by all these different types of hate speech and by white nationalist rhetoric. We don't find this increase. But what if the problem is that we were looking for the way people talk hatefully offline and people talk differently hatefully online? In some ways, it's a bit of a red herring, right? I showed you the tweets before. I put those things up there. They look pretty hateful. Like if somebody came up to you and said that to your face, you wouldn't be like, oh, you're just using internet speak in person. This seems very pleasant, right? Like, no. I mean, in some ways, I think it's a bit of a red herring. On the other hand, you can look up things, and we know that, for example, the alt-right, in an effort not to get kicked off Twitter, started using words like Googles and Yahoos to refer to Jews and Latinos instead. So maybe there's the kids are talking differently online. Maybe it's about emojis instead of about words. But maybe there's something fun, or maybe it's code words and stuff like that. But maybe there was something fundamentally different we got going online. So could we test this? And so our idea was, as I said before, we wanted to find a place with known hate speech, and then compare the tweets over time to see if over time they started to look more like the known hate speech that was online. So what we ended up doing, the concept that we ended up using here is we're going to train a model, and I'll explain exactly how we do it in a second, that predict the probability that our day's worth of tweets, any day's worth of tweets, were generated by the same data generation process that generated hateful speech on the internet. Okay, so what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you this in a second, we're going to have a model that says it breaks down lots of different subreddits into a bunch of different categories, and some of these are going to be clearly the sort of racist alt-right subreddits. And we're going to say, okay, what's the probability that the speech that we see was generated by the same data generation process as a bunch of tweets about baseball, a bunch of tweets that are pro-African American rights, a bunch of Reddits, a bunch of people writing in a place about alt-right issues. The probability that it is generated by that is essentially meaningless because it's a function of how many categories I put in there. I can make that probability go up or down by increasing the categories. But again, we're interested in the change over time. So for whatever model we train, we can then look at the change over time, and towards the end of the election campaign, does the speech on Twitter look more like it was generated by the same process that generates the speech in the alt-right subreddits than it did in the beginning? All right, so how do we actually do this? So here's another huge takeaway from this. When I started working with social media data 6 years ago, as a social scientist, I thought Reddit data is useless, right? It's anonymous by design. How can I ever get covariates on this? And because I don't know who these people are, I can't actually know anything useful about them. So I sort of forgot about it for a bunch of years. It turns out, if you want to get into text classification, I just told you a minute ago, we paid all these people online to code 25,000 tweets for us, right? If you need text that is hand-coded, Reddit is like a gold mine. Because this is how Reddit works. It's online bulletin boards where you actually are subsectioned into different areas by content. You choose ahead of time where you're going to post based on the topic. So if you are interested in the San Francisco Giants, there's a San Francisco Giants Reddit out there, right? That's what text looks like for people talking about the San Francisco Giants, right? That's not people talking about politics, that's people talking about the Giants. You want to know what people are talking about when they're talking about baseball, you can combine the text from all the Reddits that are there for all of the baseball teams, right? People, the whole internet is essentially hand annotating text for researchers if they want to use it this way, right? Because they're saying which one they belong to. But then you might say, okay, but it's the 2016 elections, and somebody might jump into the San Francisco Giants baseball subreddit and put some pro-Trump content. Well, here's why Reddit's even better. It's that the way Reddit works is it works with upvoting and downvoting. So people who are in the community then say, oh yeah, this is a good comment, or this is a bad comment. So you can actually get the entire community working as quality control for you to screen out stuff that doesn't actually apply to the topic in which you're interested in. So what we did is we downloaded all these Reddit comments from about, I think we used about 30 different subreddits for this project, and we scraped out anything that had an overall negative score. So we only took things that the community hadn't weighed in and said, no, this isn't really what we talk about here. All right, so then what we did is we took these 30 different subreddits and we trained a classifier. It's called a fast text classifier. It's kind of it's similar to a convolutional neural net, the same sort of basic technology. And it predicts essentially, we took every single comment and tried to predict which of these 30 Reddits this comment came from. That classifier, which then optimizes to learn as much as it can from all the text, how to do this job correctly. As an output of that, it produces these embeddings for each of these different subreddits that we have. And we can then use those subreddit embeddings to see which of them look similar to each other. And then we can classify them into groups. Because at the end of the day, for what I want to hear, I don't really care whether you come from a racist group that's focused on one thing that's racist versus a racist group that's focused on different things. I want a category of what this alt-right speech looks like online. So then we repeated the classification process and trained using the exact same model to go through again every single comment and predict which group of subreddits they came from. That then model allows us to, is the machine that we end up building. And then what we're able to do when that's fully trained, we then go and we pass through the entire day's collection of tweets for all 720 days in our collection. And so, again, remember the original XY graph, we now have on the x-axis the day of the election, and on the y-axis now we have the probability that that day's worth of tweets was generated by this alt-right subreddit. All right, so let me show you a bit how this works. So we start with, and by the way, if you think digging into Twitter can be depressing on what's up there, you should try digging into Reddit. But this is, we have this sort of, and what this is a kind of proof of concept, because this shows how, we didn't put these into these categories at all. This is just how these embeddings we generated from the first step by looking at these 30 different subreddits, how they cluster together. And you do find that these alt-right Reddits versus politics Reddits versus liberal Reddits versus sort of pro-African American Reddits, pro-women Reddit, they really do cluster very well. The method works very nicely. As a robustness test, we then went and took Twitter accounts to see could this apply for Twitter accounts. We started running them through, or not as a robustness test, but just a proof of concept. We started running them through. And so we started off with a bunch of, we had sports in the original one when we did this. We started off with sports teams, and sure enough, across different sports, we're able to get, these were classified as being most likely to belong in the sport account. For anti-Trump, one of my students had fun with this one, but we did a bunch of Twitter accounts, but for the anti-Trump classifier, we get the New York Times, we get Pelosi, we get McCain, And so this seems to be on face value. And then most importantly for us, our group of alt-right was really picking up these characters who are, big people in the alt, Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer. And so the model, so we did a lot of things to try to test the face validity of this work. So this was all with Twitter data that had nothing to do with any of the Reddit data that we had used to train the models. The bottom line is, we went through this huge process, developed all these new methods, and we got basically the same results. So this is the effect, and this is the daily probability that the tweet content is classified belonging to the alt-right subreddits using the Trump data, run through an interrupted time series model. There's obviously there's more noise in this data. It just sort of bounces around, but because it's it's a less precise estimator. But the trend line is the same thing. It's not like when we went to this new method, suddenly we saw this upward trend, or suddenly we saw this shift that we didn't see before. Same thing with the Clinton data. And same thing with the random sample data. Interestingly, I don't know if anyone remembers, because I went through it quickly, when I showed you the random sample data before, there was this kind of weird hump in it, which we sort of pick up here too, which is also kind of nice having to do with dealing with the model. Okay, so conclusions. Contrary to received wisdom, our results don't show a systematic increase in hate speech or white nationalist rhetoric during the election campaign. We went through this caveat. There was this one particular case. All right. What are the caveats on this, right? So you should not walk out of this talk today saying, oh, I went to this talk and hate speech isn't a problem, right? That's not the takeaway point from this, right? So there are a lot of caveats. One is, we only looked at a portion of Twitter. There are other things going on Twitter. There are other places we didn't look. We only looked at Twitter, not on other platforms. That being said, right, so we can't tell you, Gab has been in the news a bit lately. And Gab, for those of you who are new to it, right? So Reddit is this online bulletin board where we could go to find all this hate speech. Gab was for people who thought Reddit was too restrictive, and so they went and started another thing that's like a Reddit Lite type platform, which is where you can go if you found that Reddit was too restrictive. There are actually other places that are even farther out there than Gab, like 8chan and 4chan, and I'll come back to that at the very end. So it's only on Twitter. On the other hand, the received wisdom that we were trying to test here was about mainstreaming of hate online. And so we do think Twitter is kind of the dominant online platform for at least where politicians and journalists are talking about politics. There's higher politics content on Twitter than there is on Facebook. It's the second, well, not really, the third largest platform now behind Instagram, but it's a big platform. There's like 20% of the US population that's using Twitter. So nothing in this talk tells you about whether or not hate speech increased in these other corners like 8chan and 4chan, or even on Reddit. Although Brian Shafter, who's now at Tufts University, has a paper on Reddit, which finds somewhat similar stuff to what we found. In some of the more political stuff, he finds a slight increase at the end. But this work that I'm showing you here today can't tell you anything about what's going on in these other places. So I'm not saying that there wasn't an increase in hate speech in other corners of the internet. And of course, the 100-pound gorilla in the room is that we really would like to have seen this on Facebook. Because if we could do this analysis on Facebook, we would be able to talk about a much larger sample of the population, and more people are consuming information on Facebook than they are consuming information on Twitter. Although I would say that journalists who write stories about politics are consuming an awful lot of information on Twitter. So that's a caveat there. Also, what I really want to say, because I watch some of these things unfold in real time, they're horrible. This was not a research design that was set up to capture whether or not there were individual attacks on individual journalists. So nothing in our data here, unless there were horrible, horrible things. Like Julia Affi was having her face photoshopped onto pictures at concentration camps. I mean, it was devastating stuff. That wouldn't get captured in our data set unless somebody said, this is what you get for criticizing Trump, and then posted it. So again, we collected this data for lots of different reasons. Not if we had thought in 2015, if we had known that, oh, you know what we should do right now? We should set up a collection to measure hate speech when Donald Trump goes on to win the election a year and a half from now, then we probably would have written a whole bunch of other papers at that time as well. So this is sort of ex post, what could we do with the data that we had at this point in time? So there are other research designs you could do that would capture these sorts of things. Nothing about attacks on journalists and their consequences, right? It might be that hate speech didn't go up online, but you have a whole set of journalists who are now terrified to report on certain topics. That could be really, really detrimental to a democracy. So having increased hate speech in the public discourse could be detrimental to democracy, but there are other things that can be detrimental, that could be related to this topic, that don't have to do with hate speech going up, but has to do with journalists and their consequences. We have nothing in here about offline hate speech and offline attacks. Like we said, we've seen a lot of things about rise of anti-Semitic attacks. Nothing in this data contradicts that or coincides with that. I will say, however, though, from having dug into some of those ADL reports on this, they are based on self-reporting. So there is a legitimate question to be asked that in the climate of everybody talking about there being more hate speech and more hate attacks, whether or not people are more likely to report hate attacks. That doesn't mean that these hate attacks aren't happening. It doesn't mean that they're not absolutely horrible. It just means we have to think carefully about whether they're going up or whether they're continuing pre-existing trend lines. All right, that's not a caveat that's there anymore. Okay, the big picture scientific contribution here, and this has come, we're trying to, we had a version of this paper that was really targeted just at 2016. That's basically the talk I'm giving you today, but we're trying to sort of make a sort of broader argument here as well, which goes as following, which is that hate speech is an important topic today for policymakers, for pundits, for journalists. I have been telling people, I used to write on, as Matt said, I used to write on economic voting in Eastern Europe. I really didn't have to deal with the fact that I would turn on, you look on the news at the end of the day and people would be screaming about economic voting in Eastern Europe. I kind of had that field to myself at that time, right? Whereas this time there are people who are seriously interested in this, and there are people who are changing legislation, right? Germany passed a law that Facebook has to take down hateful content within 24 hours or face these sort of large fines, right? Think about that for a second. We have countries outsourcing control over what can be posted legitimately online, news online, right, to very, very large multinational corporations. We live in a time where very, very progressive people are making strong calls for Facebook to be in charge of filtering out what content is, what speech is allowed, right? Could you imagine your progressive friends if you went up to them and said, I got a great idea. Let's let ExxonMobil decide what legitimate speech should be out there, right? And yet people are asking this of giant multinational corporations, right? And right now people may trust Mark Zuckerberg to be in charge of Facebook, but I also study Russia, and the head of the Russian Facebook was kicked out of the country, had to flee the country, and was replaced by someone called Vkontakte, who was very pliant and goes with the regime, right? Imagine would you feel the same way about wanting to have Facebook, be in charge, telling Facebook they got to remove all this speech that anybody finds offensive, when the announcement is that actually the new head of Facebook is Donald Trump Jr., right? So there are serious issues at place here. I'm not saying they shouldn't do stuff to do this. I'm just saying this is something people are thinking about a lot, and are thinking about serious changes to sort of long-standing principles about how political discourse takes place. As I said before, the issue with social media is you can find evidence of anything. You want to find evidence of lesbian African-American women who like Trump, you can find them on Facebook. It doesn't mean that there are a lot of them out there, right? So this is a situation because it's big and it's optimized for search. What's really hard is to measure denominators and trends, right? To figure out over time how things are happening, and also to figure out prevalence of things. And so particularly in this hate speech, precisely because, and I'm very pleased to be speaking at a policy school today about this, precisely because there's so much policy interest in this, right? We need a method for when we really want to say, is hate speech going up or not? And so we think that one big contribution to this paper is to lay out a method. That if you are going to make these claims, we hope we've sort of put forward a roadmap whereby other people can study this. And the roadmap would have sort of two different pieces to it. One is make sure that you don't limit yourself to one particular data source, right? So we went with political data and random data here. A second thing would be to try to use different types of methods for looking at whether or not certain types of speech is occurring. We think the dictionary methods are really good, but we know if you just jump in and use dictionary methods, you're going to make mistakes, right? So it's really dictionary methods supplemented by machine learning. But we also think, having non-dictionary based methods and dictionary based methods can be really valuable in here. So I guess one conclusion would be that the topic here is very specific. Did hate speech increase over this 2-year period? But the method, it can be generalized to lots of different questions about speech online, which we think is a really important policy question today. The final thing I'll just note is to say that there's a lot of, this is a first step, right? It ended up being a first step that took us a lot longer than we thought the first step was going to take, but it's really a first step because what we've done here now is what we think is identify these trends. But now we have this new data, right? So we essentially have these 9 different time series that are 720 days, and we have these spikes in it, these time series. So there are really interesting questions to be asked about the causes and effects of those spikes. So I think we can turn that into data. Why do we get bursts in hate speech? What causes a burst in hate speech, what doesn't? And the byproduct of this study is we have really interesting data to study these things. I think we also really want to, now that we've done this on Twitter, we would love to do this on other platforms. In particular, we're hoping we might be able to get access to some Facebook data to be able to do this in the future through Social Science One. And then, of course, this connection between online hate speech and offline action. So we have another paper in our lab that actually Alex was also the lead author on, which looks at the connection between offline violence in the Middle East and online anti-Shia hate speech in Saudi Arabia. And we get very interesting results in there about which types of violent events actually lead to rises in anti-Shia hate speech. But one could begin to start doing those kind of analyses in the United States. And then I think this new text-based method of finding this speech in the wild is a really valuable method for lots of topics you might want to study. And there are lots of different sources of speech online. And so we may want to do more research with different sources of data. So anyway, thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to answer questions.
So I'll ask people to use a mic, and if you could, I'm going to give you the mic turned on, but it cuts off the front mic, so when you're done speaking, turn it off.
This one,
It doesn't?
this one shouldn't.
Okay, you say so. Okay, never mind that. Please introduce yourself before asking your question. So, what is it?
Yeah? Oh, yep, I'm back.
Hello, my name is Panagiotis. I'm actually a visiting scholar from computer science is my background. I'm sorry I missed a large part of your talk. Maybe you addressed this, but I was curious. You measured the number of tweets that are hateful. Did you measure the impact of these tweets? Meaning how many people, maybe Trump still tweets once a day, but the number of people who see the tweet has increased exponentially.
Right.
Or probably retweets are in your corpus, right?
Yeah.
So you know how many retweeted, but maybe get an idea of how many people have seen the.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I get that. We've gotten that question a lot. I think that's obviously a kind of important next step for future research. There's a technical problem with this, which is that we would have to get. Well, actually, we could go back and get what we would have is the number of followers of the people who tweeted the hate speech. So we could go back in and weight the number of tweets by the number of followers of people. What we won't know is whether those followers in turn, we have a question. It's a good point. So the short answer is no, we haven't done that. The modified answer to that is we did include all retweets in this study. And we recruited retweets for exactly this purpose, because the idea was to get how much was out there for people to get exposed to. And so if you think that the likelihood that people are going to be retweeted is kind of correlated with the number of followers they have, which most studies show that's a very strong predictor of that, then we shouldn't really find anything different if we weight this by followers, because we should see more retweets from the people who have the larger number of followers. But no, we haven't done it, and I think that would be an interesting next step to do, but we just haven't looked at that kind of analysis to try to measure it. But it's an interesting question. Maybe that did go up over the course of the election campaign, and we'd have to search out by that. There would be some interesting measurement questions, like would you do it because the problem is when you get a retweet, you know that it's retweeted, but you only get the information from the original tweet. So if I retweet Trump, that doesn't mean he's got 50 million followers, but the data is going to show 50 million followers. So there'd be some technical things we'd have to try to do to filter out by that. I mean, it's a good suggestion. Yeah, Tim.
Hey, Josh. Thank you so much for this. My God, you crammed quite a lot into that hour. I wanted to ask a question. It's actually a two-part question. One is the hate tweets that are actually coming from Trump, right? You and I have talked about this a little bit I've done a little bit of work on his tweets, having read all of them in sequence from when he started on Twitter until recently. And one of the things that the hate tweets coming from the president of the United States, that's an upward spike, right?
Yeah.
So we know that's happening, even though he's tweeting about half as much after the election as he did during the campaign, which is interesting. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about his tweeting practices and the spike that's coming from his Twitter feed, and square it a bit with some of the offline data that we do have about practices of hate, right? We know from the ADL and from the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Transgender Law Center, the Williams Institute, all these different places, some of them partisan and identity-based, but there's good data to suggest the rise of hate crimes and violence against Jews, LGBT people, black folks, immigrants, etc., is actually on the rise, right? So the incidents of it in the culture are there, which means people are doing shit offline, right, that they may not be doing online. And many of them are citing the president and his sort of the door he's opened, or the license he's given them. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of square those two things, right? What Trump specifically is doing in Twitter, and then the kind of larger cultural landscape. Because one of the things I worry about with this is that it's going to be interpreted as like, oh, hate speech isn't going up, and so we don't have a problem. It's just the liberals going crazy with their normative excesses. So how do you address that?
Yeah, okay, so on the first answer, on Trump's tweets going up, like, yes. So I haven't even done the study, but I'll go out on a limb here and say the president has tweeted more hateful speech after January 1st, 2017 than the president of the United States did before that, right? So that's not really
I've done that work.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty confident that we would probably find no hateful tweets from Obama. So, all right, okay, so what are the effects of Trump's tweets? That's a huge question. And I think it's an absolutely legitimate question. And there actually tend to be a lot of people, yourself included, who are doing research on this. So that's a different type of study from what we're doing. Now, you could combine it with the other statement, which is to say, like, there would be something interesting to say, like, what proportion of the tweets that we have classified as hateful here are direct retweets of what the president has said. It's probably not going to be that much, because as much as Trump has broken through all sorts of norms about this, most of his tweets wouldn't end up being classified, under one of these dictionary-based methods. Some of them would.
Yeah,
Don't get me wrong. Some of them would. But a lot of them wouldn't, and a lot of them are breaks in decorum, breaks in the manner you speak about. They're more dog whistles and stuff like that. So I think that's an entire field of speech that's like it's not orthogonal to what we're doing. It's part of understanding the broader information ecosystem. And I think if we had found the increase that we thought we were going to find, then the next step would have been, okay, how much is this directly attributable to Trump? Like, there are a lot of other things that have happened from the summer of 2015 to the summer of 2017, and then we would have dove into Trump's tweets, and that could have been something you put on these time series data sets. Since we didn't find that increase, right, like, that's not the question to be asked right now. And again, nothing we have found here is intended to mitigate against the changes in what's happening and what the president is doing. And that may be having 100 times more of an impact on everything than having a small increase in the number of tweets on Twitter would have had. We were trying to figure out, was this being mainstreamed? Were more people who were using this popular platform using this language? And the answer is they weren't, right? Which is strange, right? It's not what we thought, and it's not what we've heard about this. But actually, it's a good thing to go into your second question, which comes back to sort of one of the original points about this, and my real concern about this. Because actually, look, we've worked on the language in this thing a million times. We've heard about, we've thought about it a lot, and definitely that's a question. We want to make sure this is interpreted. And I don't usually write papers that have like, here are 17 caveats on how you shouldn't interpret this, this data. We're very cognizant of the fact of the way this could be looked at. But let me go back to the point, what I have, having spent 2 years looking at this data now, am actually kind of worried about. And then as I said, there's another, for those of you who are interested, we have a Journal of Democracy article that's called From Liberation to Turmoil, that is about a sort of general theory of the relationship between social media and democracy, and how this sort of has spread from how social media can be liberation technology in 2011, and how it's can democracy survive the internet in 2017. And this question about amplification plays a big role in how this develops these bots and trolls that amplify stuff. So the rise of online hate crimes, right? Two things about that. One is, I've looked at the ADL data. It's all self-reports.
Yeah,
right? So there is a question of whether you're more likely to self-report something as a hate crime when Donald Trump is president spewing hate than when Barack Obama is president talking about unity. We don't know that. There are other people than I.
Black church burning.
Yeah, black church burning, all these things. Like these questions need to be dug into, because again, one of the most interesting comments I got on this hate speech thing was when I presented at Stanford Law School, and someone said, "Why do you keep saying you're surprised? You're surprised that when the racist ran for president, there was more racist tweeting? Don't you think that when the African American ran for president, that's when you'd see the upsurge in racist tweeting, right?" So these trend line questions are really important here. So that's one answer. I don't know if there's more self-reporting. And some of the other data might be based on other things, but even if it's based on police reports require people to come in, and maybe are police stations more, attuned to this stuff? I don't know, but I think we have to dig into it. But let's posit that that's wrong. Let's posit that there has been an upsurge in this. When you look at the numbers from 400 to 800, like those are horrible. Like that's 400 more anti-Semitic incidents than we had previously. But I showed you the data. There's 50,000 tweets that are actually kind of hateful out there that use this awful language, right? There's already a lot of people in the United States who harbor these kind of views. So I think you can absolutely square this that with saying, look, and this is something that as a comparativist and having done comparative politics before I got into all this social media stuff, right? In countries that have proportional representation, the sort of model progressive social democratic countries in the world, Sweden, Denmark, these countries were routinely getting 8% of the population, 10% of the population, it goes up and down voting for essentially fascist parties, right? I think for a long time in the United States, because we had a two-party system, right, it was very easy to suggest, oh yeah, we don't actually have people who are we don't have 8% of our population that supports fascist ideology. Look, all of the Congress is from Republicans and Democrats. They're all from mainstream parties. We don't have, the Front National that they have in France who gets people into the parliament. But that's a function of the electoral system, right? And that it favors two parties and this sort of thing. So I think it is perfectly possible to square the fact that there is a subset of people who are using the internet to spread very hateful language, and that there is an even tighter core of those people who feel emboldened by Trump to act on these things, or emboldened by the current climate. I think we have to be careful about attributing it all to Trump, right? For a lot of different reasons, but who now feel emboldened, and maybe it's that they're emboldened by seeing a lot of this hate speech, and maybe it's a cumulative effect of having seen hate speech and gotten a president who didn't disavow it elected. But I think the idea that you have small numbers of people who are extremists who are now more willing to resort to violence is perfectly squareable with the fact that you don't have more than, half a percentage of the population that's engaging in this kind of activity online. It's not a half a percentage of the population that's engaging in hate crimes. I mean, that would be 1 million people. We're talking about hundreds, or we're talking about, other numbers. So I think, and this is why I think this stuff is so important, because we jump from saying, look, there's been an increase in reported hate crimes, and then we say, look, and there's so much more hate speech on Twitter. This is like a population-wide phenomenon. Does that then send a message to people that this is a population-wide phenomenon, when in reality it's a fringe element, right? And so that's why I think this is important. But I don't know if that's right. Maybe it's not a fringe element. There are other stories you could tell about this data that would say, no, actually, even though you find a flat trend line in the proportion of people over the course of the campaign talking hatefully on Twitter, well, if the original really hateful people went to Reddit or Gab and they were replaced by new people, so the sort of moderate hate people on Twitter became radicalized and they wanted to only hang out in 8chan, and they were replaced by another cohort of people who used to not be, and then, we can tell convoluted stories that say these numbers are going up with the data I've presented. So that's how I would say it. And I'm going to do my best as we, talk about this publicly to be very sort of clear about what it can and cannot show. But I do think it's important to get into the discourse.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Meg Schwensfire. I'm a PhD student in the government department here. And I had a question related to the comment you just made about the moderation that was going on these platforms while you were collecting the data. So whether Twitter enforces their terms of use is sort of a related question, but some hate speech should get you banned from Twitter.
Right.
Every so often, Reddit goes through and gets rid of subreddits that are misogynist or racist. And so, I had a question about replacement, and if you can tell whether tweeting hate speech at the beginning of your time series increases the probability that someone was banned from Twitter later in the time series, that sort of thing. And if they are being replaced, if that does indicate that there may have been an increase in hate speech.
So as I said, I just gave that answer a second ago, where I think there is a story you can tell where there's an increase because the extremists are moving elsewhere or getting banned, but they're being replaced by people. So if we wanted to use what was going on Twitter to estimate the population effect beyond Twitter, but still on the internet, is probably a little higher than we had here. So you can tell it's right. I tend to be Occam's razor. Like, I think it's a convoluted story. I think the much simpler thing, the much simpler story is just this is a small group of people who engage in this behavior, and they engage in it at roughly the same rate, and they attract a bunch of people's attention at particular moments when they can all sort of coordinate and do it simultaneously, and then you get a lot of stories. I mean, I really do, the next thing I'm super interested in is trying to use these data to understand when we get reporting on it, what drives the reporting on this. If the narrative is not correct, I mean, I can figure out mathematically ways, like I can play these games where I say, oh, if you report on these 10 days, you are correct that they did go up over those 10 days, things like that. Okay, so that's one question. The larger question about what's going on, and this is always a question in social media analysis, like in the bots work, now you have to do like before the great bot purge and after the great bot purge, and these kinds of things. In general, I don't think one of the critiques that has come out of the 2016 election is that Twitter was being too aggressive in getting rid of hate speech and getting rid of people who are online. There's been more since then. So that's an interesting question. I think it was such a small number of people. But again, we're in the realm of kind of smaller numbers than we thought we were in the realm of. And given that these are such small proportions, if some proportion of it came from people who left and other people, you could have this. I think that's an interesting question about the likelihood of tweeting earlier in this period, increasing your likelihood of getting kicked off the platform. The problem is, so speaking of Twitter's terms of service, it's becoming increasingly difficult now to do sort of large-scale API call things, and that's a very large-scale API call project, because what we would have had to be doing to do that is we would have had to be hitting the API concurrently with the hate speech. So that's a research design you could put together, that anytime somebody ends up in the data set, you hit the API on them and then you loop back to them. The problem is we have no way of knowing whether they got kicked off Twitter or they just stopped tweeting in our data set collections. So I guess the random sample you could use that for. Actually, we have that data. So yeah, we could check that in the random sample. I was thinking about the big collection. It's a great question, actually. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Donald Tipper. I'm a retired scientist, and I'd like to thank you for two wonderful talks, very informative. What I would like to ask is whether there is a way to look at the overlap between fake news and hate speech, particularly if that's instigated from external sources.
So, I will give you a giant, coming attraction. This morning, sitting in my hotel room, I was working on the final revisions. We're about to release something called a SMAP data report, where we actually look at the links shared by Russian trolls on Twitter in this data dump that Twitter just made about these 10 million tweets from Russian trolls over the course of the election. So coming from the external sources, and I can give you a preview of the big result here, which is that we actually find in that troll data set, in general, we find much less of this junk news category than we expected to find. And actually what these trolls were releasing, when you talk about the external actors, was a tremendous amount of news from local news sources. So like the Kansas newspaper or the Missouri newspaper or things like that. These trolls were very active in tweeting information from local newspapers that are not considered low quality newspapers. There was, however, a surge in the amount of junk news that was tweeted in the couple of months before the election. But getting back to the question of hate speech, we have another paper that we're working on in the lab where we've been analyzing the YouTube videos that were shared by these same trolls. And on the YouTube data, and this is extremely preliminary, so don't quote me on this right now, this is very much work in progress. But on the YouTube videos, it appears that they tend to be sort of overwhelmingly right-wing and more on this kind of extremist language of speech. So there may be a really interesting distinction between videos that were being shared and links that were being shared by these accounts. But in general, everything having to do with social media, in a sense, going back to this question of how the feeds are determined, right, is an attention game. The goal of a social media platform is to get you there and then keep you there. So one of the questions that's always been raised about this fake news is, was it more exciting because it was more titillating and that was more likely to keep people wanting to read it and wanting to click on links and wanting to do things like this? And so your question about whether hate speech could be used to sort of facilitate fake news as well, on the one hand, I think there's some scientific research that suggests if you make it more provocative, you might be more like, so you could use provocative language and then hopefully get people to click on links, and that might increase the likelihood of it. But on your foreign interference thing, it seems from what we've seen from this troll data is that actually they were more trying to harness the fact that Americans have trust in their local news media sources more, to use that as a vehicle for getting things out than sort of titillating kind of offensive language to get people to be drawn in there. But that's a big caveat. The report we have coming out about the trolls is focusing on the links, not the text of the tweets that would contain those links. This particular study all focused on the text.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so if we could just, one more time. Awesome. In front of me.
Yeah.
We gotta get a picture of you that are, you know.
Yes.
It's interesting, but I still feel.
Yeah, no, the goal is to make it.
Oh my God, I know.
Well, the power law stuff, I don't think you can make Oh, sorry. Yeah, from Liberation of the Journal of Democracy. Yeah. Oh yeah, you totally get it. Yeah, if you have any academics. If you have any academics. Yeah. You can get it. And if not, just email.
What'd you think?
I'll send it to you. Yeah, I'd be happy to send it to you. And that's it. That was the Journal of Democracy.
necessarily wanted.
Both a policy.
Or that you expect. Which you
And an academic audience. So there's like no data in that. It's just a kind of big thing.
Yeah.
It's a tough conclusion.
can keep
It needs to be connected.
Oh, no, don't worry about it at all. So I actually found that article that's 70-degree rainy in Boston.
In November.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Good to see you too. You're off to tour.
And I think that probably what changed.
Will you tell them to text me when you
Yeah, well, we're gonna have a lot of stuff.
We're gonna find somewhere.
More stuff going. And actually, we're gonna have an event.